Chapter 1 continued. With the presence of Mr. Inglethorpe, a sense of constraint and veiled hostility seemed to settle down upon the company. Miss Howard, in particular, took no pains to conceal her feelings. Mrs. Inglethorpe, however, seemed to notice something unusual. Her volubility, which I remembered of old, had lost nothing in their intervening years, and she poured out a steady flood of conversation, mainly on the subject of the forthcoming bazaar which she was organizing and which was to take place shortly. Occasionally she referred to her husband over a question of days or dates. His watchful and attentive manner never varied. From the very first I took a firm and rooted dislike of him, and I flatter myself that my first judgments are usually fairly shrewd. Presently Mrs. Inglethorpe turned to give some instructions about letters to Evelyn Howard, and her husband addressed me in his painstaking voice. "Is soldiering your regular profession, Mr. Hastings?" "No, before the war I was in Lloyd's." "And you will return there after it is over?" "Perhaps, either that or a fresh start altogether." Mary Cavendish leaned forth. "What would you really choose as a profession, if you could just consult your inclination?" "Well, that depends." "No secret hobby?" she asked. "Tell me, you're drawn to something? Everyone is. Usually something absurd. You'll laugh at me." She smiled. "Perhaps." "Well, I've always had a secret hankering to be a detective." "The real thing? Scotland Yard or Sherlock Holmes?" "Oh, Sherlock Holmes by all means. But really, seriously, I am awfully drawn to it. I came across a man in Belgium once, a very famous detective, and he quite inflamed me. He was a marvelous little fellow. He used to say that all good detectives' work was a mere matter of method. My system is based on his, though, of course, I have progressed rather further. He's a funny little man, great dandy, but wonderfully clever." I like a good detective story myself," remarked Miss Howard. "Lots of nonsense written, though. Criminal discovered in the last chapter. Everyone is dumbfounded. Real crime? You'd know at once." "There have been a great number of undiscovered crimes," I argued. "Don't mean police, but the people that are right in it. The family. You couldn't really hoodwink them. They'd know." "Then," I said, much amused, "you think that if you were mixed up in a crime, say a murder, you'd be able to spot the murderer right off?" "Of course I should. Might be able to prove it a pack of lawyers, but I'm certain I'd know. I'd feel it in my fingertips if it came near me." "Might be a she," I suggested. "Might. But murder's a violent crime. Associate more with a man." "Not in the case of poisoning," Mrs. Cavendish's clear voice startled me. "Dr. Borstein was saying yesterday that, owing to the general ignorance of the more uncommon poisons among the medical profession, there were probably countless cases of poisoning quite unsuspected." "Why, Mary, what a gruesome conversation!" cried Mrs. Inglethorpe. "It'd make me feel as if a goose were walking over my grave." "Oh, there's Cynthia!" A young girl in VAD uniform ran lightly across the lawn. "Why, Cynthia, you are late today. This is Mr. Hastings. Miss Murdoch?" Cynthia Murdoch was a fresh-looking young creature, full of life and vigor. She tossed off her little VAD cap, and I admired the great loose waves of her auburn hair, and the smallness and whiteness of the hand she had held out to claim her tea. With dark eyes and eyelashes, she would have been a beauty. She flung herself down on the ground beside John, and as I handed her a plate of sandwiches, she smiled up at me. "Sit down here on the grass, do. It's ever so much nicer." I dropped down obediently. "You work at Tadminster, don't you, Miss Murdoch?" She nodded. "For my sins." "Do they bully you, then?" I asked, smiling. "I should like to see them," cried Cynthia with dignity. "I have got a cousin who is nursing," I remarked, "and she is terrified of sisters." "I don't wonder. Sisters are, you know, Mr. Hastings. They simply are. You've no idea. And I'm not a nurse, thank heaven. I work in a dispensary." "How many people do you poison?" I asked, smiling. Cynthia smiled too. "Oh, hundreds," she said. "Cynthia," called Miss Inglethorpe, "do you think you could write a few notes for me?" "Certainly, Aunt Emily." She jumped up promptly, and something in her manner reminded me that her position was a dependent one, and that Mrs. Inglethorpe, kind as she might be in the main, did not allow her to forget it. My hostess turned to me. "John will show you your room. Supper is at 7:30. We have given up late dinner for some time now. Lady Tadminster, our member's wife, She was the late Lady Abishbury's daughter, does the same. She agrees with me that one must set an example of economy. We are quite a war household. Nothing is wasted here. Every scrap of waste paper even is saved and sent away in sacks. I expressed my appreciation, and John took me into the house and up to the board staircase, which forked right and left halfway to different wings of the building. My room was in the left wing, and looked out over the park. John left me, and a few minutes later I saw him from my window and walked slowly across the grass arm in arm with Cynthia Murdoch. I heard Miss Inglethorpe call Cynthia impatiently. The girl started and ran back to the house. At the same moment, a man stepped out from the shadow of a tree and walked slowly in the same direction. He looked about 40, very dark with a melancholy, clean-shaven face. Some violent emotion seemed to be mastering him. He looked up at my window as he passed, and I recognized him, though he had changed much in the 15 years that had elapsed since I last seen him. It was John's younger brother, Lawrence Cavendish. I wondered what it was that had brought that singular expression to his face. But I dismissed him from my mind, and returned to the contemplation of my own affairs. The evening passed by pleasantly enough, and I dreamt that night of that enigmatical woman, Mary Cavendish. The next morning I dawned bright and sunny, and I was full of anticipation of a delightful visit. I did not see Mrs. Cavendish until lunchtime, when she volunteered to take me for a walk, and we spent a charming afternoon roaming in the woods, returning to the house about 5. As we entered the large hall, John beckoned us both into the smoking room. I saw at once by his face that something disturbing had occurred. We followed him in, and he shut the door after us. "Look here, Mary, there's a deuce of a mess. Evie's had a row with Alfred Inglethorpe, and she's off." "Evie? Off?" John nodded gloomily. "Yes. You see, she went to the mater, and, here's Evie herself." Miss Howard entered. Her lips were set grimly together, and she carried a small suitcase. She looked excited and determined, and slightly on defensive. "At any rate," she burst out, "I've spoken my mind." "My dear Evelyn," cried Miss Cavendish, "this can't be true." Miss Howard nodded grimly. "True enough. Afraid I said some things to Emily. She won't forget or forgive in a hurry. Don't mind if they're only sunk in a bit. Probably water off a duck's boat, though. I said right out, you're an old woman, Emily, and there's no fool like an old fool. The man's 20 years younger than you, and don't you fool yourself as to what he married you for. Money. Well, don't let him have too much of it. Farmer Ricks have got a very pretty young wife, and just ask your Alfred how much time he spends over there." She was very angry. "Natural," I went on. "I'm going to warn you, whether you like it or not, that man would as soon murder you in your bed as look at you. He's a bad lot. You can say what you will like to him, but remember what I've told you. He's a bad lot." "What did he say?" Miss Howard made an extremely expressive grimace. "Darling Alfred, dearest Alfred, wicked calumnies, wicked lies, wicked woman, to accuse her dear husband. The sooner I left her house, the better, so I'm off. But not now, this minute." For a moment she sat and stared at her. Finally, John Cavendish, finding his persuasion of no avail, went off to look up the trains. His wife followed him, murmuring something about persuading Mrs. Inglethorpe to think better of it. As she left the room, Miss Howard's face changed. She leaned towards me eagerly. "Mr. Hastings, you're earnest. I can trust you?" I was a little startled. She laid her hand on my arm and sank her voice to a whisper. "Look after her, Mr. Hastings. My poor Emily. They're all a lot of sharks, all of them. Oh, I know what I'm talking about. There isn't one of them that's not hard up in trying to get money out of her. I'm protecting her as best as I could. Now I'm out of the way, they'll impose upon her." "Of course, Miss Howard," I said. "I'll do everything I can, but I'm sure you're excited and overwrought." She interrupted me by simply shaking her forefinger. "Young man, trust me. I've lived in the world rather longer than you have. All I ask is you is to keep your eyes open. You'll see what I mean." The throb of the motor came through the open window. Miss Howard rose and moved to the door. John's voice sounded outside. With her hand on the handle, she turned her head over her shoulder and beckoned to me. "Above all, Mr. Hastings, watch that devil, her husband." There was no time for more. Miss Howard was swallowed up in an eager chorus of protests and goodbyes. The Inglethorpes did not appear. As the motor drove away, Mrs. Cavendish suddenly detached herself from the group and moved across the drive to the lawn to meet a tall, bearded man who had been evidently making for the house. The color rose in her cheeks as she held out her hand to him. "Who is that?" I asked sharply, for instinctively I distrusted the man. "That's Dr. Bauerstein," said John shortly. "And who is Dr. Bauerstein?" "He's staying in the village during a rest cure after a bad nervous breakdown. He's a London specialist, a very clever man, one of the greatest living experts on poisons, I believe." "And he's a great friend of Mary's," put in Cynthia, the irrepressible. John Cavendish frowned and changed the subject. "Come for a stroll, Hastings. This has been a most rotten business. She always had a rough tongue, but there is no stauncher friend in England than Evelyn Howard." He took the path through plantation, and we walked down to the village through the woods which bordered one side of the estate. As we passed through one of the gates on our way home again, a pretty young woman of gypsy type, coming to the opposite direction, bowed and smiled. "That's a pretty girl," I remarked appreciatively. John's face hardened. "That is Mrs. Raikes." "The one that Miss Howard—" "Exactly," said John, with our unnecessary abruptness. I thought of the white-haired old lady in the big house, and that vivid, wicked little face that had just smiled into ours. A vague chill of foreboding crept over me. I brushed it aside. "Styles was really a glorious old place," I said to John. He nodded, rather gloomily. "Yes, it's a fine property. It'll be mine some day. Should be mine now by rights, if my father had only made a decent will. And then I shouldn't be so damned hard up as I am now." "Hard up, are you?" "My dear Hastings, I don't mind telling you I'm at my wit's end for money." "Couldn't your brother help you?" "Lawrence? He's gone through every penny he ever had, publishing rotten verses in fancy bindings. No, we're on a pecunious lot. My mother's always been awfully good to us, I must say, that is, up till now. Since her marriage, of course." He broke off, frowning. For the first time I felt that, with Evelyn Howard, something indefinable had gone from the atmosphere. Her presence had spelt security. That security was removed. The air seemed rife with suspicion. The sinister face of Dr. Bauerstein recurred to me unpleasantly. A vague suspicion of everyone and everything filled my mind. Just for a moment, I had a premonition of approaching evil.